The tank wouldn't start. The $500,000 M1 Abrams sat silent despite the best efforts of 6 male mechanics who'd spent 4 hours trying to diagnose the problem. Now it was the female mechanic's turn. 32-year-old Rachel Torres popped the engine compartment, and everyone was about to discover who she really was. Because sometimes the biggest surprises come from the most unexpected places. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Drop your city in the comments and subscribe if you believe expertise comes in forms people don't always recognize. Rachel's story will show you why assumptions about capability can be dangerously wrong. Fort Carson's main repair facility buzzed with controlled chaos every morning as mechanics worked to keep America's armored fleet combat ready. The facility serviced everything from Humvees to main battle tanks, employing dozens of specialists trained on specific vehicle systems. Rachel Torres had worked there for 18 months, earning respect through consistent performance and technical knowledge that impressed veteran mechanics. What her colleagues didn't know was that Rachel understood these vehicles from a completely different perspective. As a former Army helicopter pilot with 8 years of active duty, she'd learned to diagnose mechanical problems from the cockpit, often identifying issues that ground crews missed. Her transition to civilian life had led her to mechanical work, but she'd never mentioned her military aviation background during the hiring process. The M1 Abrams that had everyone stumped belonged to the 3rd Armored Division, fresh from a training exercise where it had developed an intermittent starting problem. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the facility's senior technician, had already replaced the starter motor, checked the electrical system, and run diagnostics on every computer-controlled component without success. Joining Rodriguez were 5 other mechanics, each bringing years of experience with armored vehicles. Tom Bradley had worked on tanks for 15 years and held multiple ASE certifications. James Wilson was a former Army mechanic himself, with 2 combat deployments and extensive training on Abrams systems. The group represented decades of collective experience with military vehicles. Rachel had been assigned to routine maintenance on other vehicles while the men tackled the complex Abrams problem. She watched from across the bay as they systematically worked through troubleshooting procedures, their frustration growing with each failed attempt to identify the source of the starting issues. The tank would start sometimes, run normally for hours, then refuse to start again without any apparent pattern. "This is impossible," Bradley announced loudly enough for the entire facility to hear. "We've checked everything twice. The electrical system tests perfect, the starter's brand new, and all the sensors are within specifications." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Command wants this tank back in service by tomorrow morning. If we can't figure this out, we'll have to request a specialist team from the manufacturer." Rachel continued working on her assigned Humvee, but her attention was divided between her immediate task and the technical discussion happening around the Abrams. The symptoms they described triggered memories from her pilot days, when similar intermittent problems had plagued helicopter engines with devastating consequences, if not properly diagnosed. During her lunch break, Rachel approached the group clustered around the silent tank. The mechanics were reviewing technical manuals and computer printouts, searching for clues they might have missed in their exhaustive troubleshooting process. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked quietly, setting down her sandwich on a nearby toolbox. Bradley glanced up with barely concealed irritation. "Rachel, we appreciate the offer, but this is pretty complex stuff. Tank engines aren't like the light vehicles you usually work on. We've got it handled." Rodriguez was more diplomatic, but equally dismissive. "It's a tough problem, Rachel. We've been working on Abrams systems for years, and this one's got us stumped. Might be better to let us handle the heavy machinery while you focus on what you know best." Rachel nodded politely, but didn't move away from the tank. "Have you checked the turbine inlet temperature sensors?" she asked, studying the engine compartment with practiced eyes. The Abrams used a gas turbine engine rather than conventional diesel, a system she understood from her aviation background. Wilson looked up sharply. We checked all the temperature sensors. They're reading normally within the specified range. But what if one of them is giving intermittent false readings? Rachel continued, her voice gaining confidence. A sensor that tests fine under static conditions but fails under thermal cycling could cause exactly the symptoms you're describing. The group exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with growing interest. Rachel's question demonstrated understanding of the Abrams engine systems that surprised them, but they had already tested the components she mentioned. Bradley pulled out a multimeter and attached the leads to the primary temperature sensor. Reading 68 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly where it should be with the engine cold. Rachel moved closer to examine the sensor installation. The reading's fine, but look at the sensor housing. See how it's slightly loose? If that sensor intermittently loses thermal contact with the engine, it could send erratic signals to the engine control unit without showing up in static testing. Rodriguez frowned as he examined the sensor mounting more closely. The housing did appear slightly loose, though it was hardly noticeable without careful inspection. Even if that were the problem, how would you know to look for something that specific? Rachel hesitated, realizing her explanation would reveal more about her background than she'd intended to share. I've seen similar problems in other turbine engines, she said carefully. Sometimes the simplest explanations are the right ones, even when they're hard to find. Wilson was already loosening the sensor housing to inspect the thermal contact surface. Son of a bitch, he muttered as the sensor came free. The thermal paste is completely dried out, and there's corrosion on the contact surface. This sensor's been giving intermittent readings for weeks. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the group. If Rachel was right, they'd found the source of a problem that had stumped 6 experienced mechanics and threatened to delay the tank's return to service. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how a female mechanic working on light vehicles had diagnosed a problem they'd missed. Let's clean this up and see if she starts, Rodriguez decided, applying fresh thermal compound to the sensor contact surface. If this works, Rachel, you just saved us a lot of headaches and possibly some careers. 20 minutes later, the M1 Abrams roared to life with the distinctive whine of its gas turbine engine. The mechanics ran through startup procedures multiple times, and the tank responded perfectly each time without any hint of the intermittent problems that had plagued it for days. The facility erupted in cheers and congratulations, but the celebration was tinged with curiosity about Rachel's unexpected expertise. Bradley approached her with a mixture of respect and confusion. Rachel, that was incredible diagnostic work. Where did you learn so much about turbine engine systems? Most automotive mechanics wouldn't even know where to start with something like this. Rachel realized she could no longer maintain the fiction that she was just another mechanic. Her colleagues deserved an explanation for knowledge that had just solved a problem beyond their combined experience. I used to fly helicopters, she admitted quietly. Army aviation for 8 years. Turbine engines all work on similar principles, whether they're powering aircraft or tanks. The revelation hit like a physical blow. The woman they dismissed as suitable only for light vehicle maintenance was a former military pilot with years of experience diagnosing complex mechanical problems under life-or-death circumstances. Wilson stared at her with new understanding. You were a pilot. What kind of helicopters? UH-60 Blackhawks mostly, Rachel replied. Some Apache time toward the end of my service. When you're flying at 200 feet with engine problems, you learn to diagnose issues pretty quickly. Rodriguez felt his worldview shifting as he processed the implications. We've been treating you like a junior mechanic when you've got more turbine engine experience than all of us combined. Why didn't you mention this when you were hired? Rachel's smile was tinged with sadness. Because people make assumptions about female mechanics, and they make different assumptions about female pilots. I wanted to be judged on my current work, not my past credentials. The awkward silence that followed was broken by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, the base maintenance officer, who'd come to check on the progress of the troubled Abrams repair. "The tank's running perfectly, sir," Rodriguez reported. "Rachel here identified the problem that had us stumped for 2 days." Colonel Harrison studied Rachel with new interest. "Outstanding work. What's your background with Abrams systems?" "She's a former Army pilot, sir," Wilson explained before Rachel could respond. 8 years of flight experience with turbine engines." Harrison's eyebrows rose as he reassessed the woman he'd barely noticed during previous facility inspections. "Pilot," he repeated slowly. "What's a qualified aviator doing in our motor pool?" The question hung in the air as Rachel considered how much of her story to share. She had left military aviation after a mission that had ended badly, taking civilian work to escape memories and expectations that came with her former role. But standing in this motor pool, surrounded by colleagues who finally saw her capabilities, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: recognition for skills she'd earned through years of dedicated service. "I missed working on the machines," she said finally. "Flying them was incredible, but understanding how they work, fixing them when they break, that's satisfaction of a different kind." Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Torres, it seems we've been underutilizing your expertise. Would you be interested in expanding your responsibilities to include turbine engine systems across our entire fleet?" The offer represented everything Rachel had thought she wanted when she'd taken the civilian position: recognition, advancement, and the chance to use skills she'd developed through years of military service. But it also meant acknowledging the past she'd tried to leave behind. She looked around at her colleagues, seeing respect in their eyes that hadn't been there that morning. Bradley extended his hand with genuine admiration. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. We all do. You just taught us something important about assumptions and expertise." Wilson nodded agreement. "From now on, when we've got turbine problems, you're our first call. No questions asked." As Rachel shook hands with each of her colleagues, she felt the weight of pretense lifting from her shoulders. She'd spent 18 months trying to be someone she wasn't, hiding capabilities that could benefit everyone around her. The M1 Abrams sitting nearby, now running perfectly, represented more than just a successful repair. It was proof that expertise came in forms people didn't always recognize, and that the most valuable team members were often hiding in plain sight. Her transition from dismissed female mechanic to respected aviation expert had taken less than an hour, but the journey had been years in the making. Sometimes the biggest revelations came not from complex investigations, but from simple willingness to see people as they really were, rather than as assumptions suggested they should be. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments about a time when someone surprised you with hidden expertise. Subscribe to Hidden Legends for more stories, proving that capability often wears disguises, and never judge someone's potential by their current position.